ability, I don't know, you call it a translator, whatever you want to do. But my ability to kind of understand the context on one side of the aisle and then present it to the other group has really opened some doors for me. And so that's kind of the foundation, the basis that I'm approaching this from today. And so one of the things coming to this HBCU here, and I moved here approximately 2 years ago, this coming up August. Um, One of the things I realized was just how much of my understanding of race in education has been really one-sided, and that I didn't really understand some of the issues facing minorities, especially African Americans, within the education system, until I transitioned to this HBCU, and I'm at Lincoln University in Jefferson City, Missouri right now. So I guess for me, one of the things that I'm always a big fan of is laying out conceptual foundations. And so if I'm going to talk about my experiences, you kind of got to know who I am. I'm was born to a white father and a black mother in 1970 October, and um, one of the things that struck me recently is that it was only in 1967 that interracial marriages were made legal throughout the United States. Before 1967, many states had laws prohibiting interracial marriages. And so, for all intents and purposes, I was a new thing. I mean, not to say that biraciality hadn't existed in the United States, obviously, but the idea of me as who I am, as my very identity being recognized and legally identified and able to participate in society in all the same ways, that was a new thing. Now, again, I have to, this is going to be a constant theme. A lot of these things I did not see as I was growing up. I did not understand the importance of them. I did not see the impact of them on my life. And so, for instance, one of the things that I remember now, perhaps differently than I did then, was I was right in the middle of desegregation and busing in the 1970s. And so my memory of this, and I put up these maps of Poughkeepsie. First, for those that you want to know where I'm talking about, Poughkeepsie here is about halfway between New York City and Albany in New York. And over here you see this is the city. This is where I grew up. And it's important to understand, to give you an idea. This orange line is a east-west arterial that kind of separates my hometown from a north and a south perspective. And it was ironic growing up watching some of the Hollywood movies that talked like the wrong side of the tracks, if you will. The north side was the poor side, and the south side was the rich side, and our tracks were the arterials. But the same dynamic very much existed. I grew up right here in Mansion Square Park, and we had originally it was funny. My first memory is actually growing up in a projects, and my father was the only white person in the entire projects. And so one of the interesting things about that dynamic was whenever anybody else had money issues or food issues, they'd come to our house with the assumption that, well, there's a white guy there, they're going to have way more money, way more food, and they'll be able to help us through to the end of the month. And so that was my earliest recollection of this race issue, but I did not understand its significance. We quickly moved, and I'll talk about this a little bit as well. We quickly moved to Mansion Square Park, which is right here. The school I was supposed to go to was called Morris School, and it was located right here. But my parents fought really hard to get me to what they thought was a better school, and that school was across town over here. Now, looking at this map, you don't get the real difference here. It was a 2 block walk to Morris School for me from where my house was. It was a half hour, 40-minute walk from where I lived to the school across town. To me, I just, okay, that's where my parents wanted me to go to school. But I didn't understand until later that, the minority population in Morris School was 3 to 4 times what it was in Clinton School, where I ended up going. Um, I'd never had an African American teacher at any time. And my experiences there, again, I didn't understand the impact of it, but I was very aware from an early age that the area that I was learning in, the community that I was becoming a part of, was much lighter than the community where I would go home and play with. And so I guess one of the things that I would start bringing out relative to this idea of my experiences through education was that very quickly there was a separation between the group of individuals I went to school with and learned with, and the group of individuals that I lived with. And that distinction, especially as biracial, actually ended up causing friction in both areas, because in the end, I felt like I didn't quite fit in with my white friends at school, And at the same time, I was increasingly not fitting in with my black friends at home. And for me, what it did was, at least initially, it led to me focusing even more on education, more on the idea of learning about the world around me, since it didn't seem that I was going to be taught a whole lot about the world around me. As I say here, race was a thing. Race was a thing for sure, but I didn't know what that meant. So like looking at this picture, for instance, this isn't actually my real father. This is my stepfather. My real father, and in 1970, if you're an 18-year-old Italian boy, you're not going to very easily go home and tell your parents that you just got a black girl pregnant at high school. And so my father was never in the scene. To this day, I do not know him. I've never met him. My stepfather married my mom when I was 2.5, and so this is me sitting with my stepfather, my grandfather, and my great grandfather. And it's an interesting photo just because it really, in many ways, encapsulates. I did not have any sort of African American influences really growing up. My mother was very focused on professional development and attaining her own degrees, which she would eventually do, attaining a degree from Vassar College in Poughkeepsie. But race was never in our house. It was certainly never talked about on an aggressive level or a confrontational level. In fact, talking to my sister recently, I don't remember my mom ever really referring to us from a racial perspective. Um, she would get, as she liked to put it, angry black woman with my dad whenever they had, arguments or whatever. But in the end, race. I was not raised in a household where race was a critical consideration. And when you combine that with the degree to which education was kind of separated from what I understood to be my community, or at least my neighborhood, education really became kind of another dimension, another place that I went to learn things or do things, but not necessarily that were going to apply to where I was. Um, Again, looking back, one other thing that I have to, so the school I went to, the elementary school, was Clinton School, but something that in hindsight I have to say was probably, I actually now view it as one of the most important components of my early education. My parents went out of their way to try and scrape the money to get me into the Vassar College preschool program. I don't know if any of you know or have ever heard of Vassar College, but it's right there, borderline Ivy League. Vassar College is a world-renowned school, and I tell you, its campus is all old Gothic. So this is a picture of the actual building where I went to preschool. Um, what was interesting is I didn't realize until later the impact it had on my life in terms of my understanding what education was. If I went to a school and it didn't look like Vassar College with its arched, library ceilings, and then I was thinking that ultimately it wasn't real education. I was really I did not realize until later in my life how directly impacted I was, not just by being introduced to higher education and its culture at an early age, but just the framing of that culture. I mean, it's one thing to be introduced to higher education because you're sitting in your parents' lap at the cafeteria at the local community college. It was a whole nother ball game to walk through the buildings and the corridors at Vassar College and meet the professors. It really instilled in me this idea that education was kind of this higher calling, if you will. And again, it was something that really didn't manifest until later on in my life. But it's important that you guys know where I come from relative to where we're talking about me going. Um, should I pause or take any questions? Or you're muted, Rick.
Yeah, sorry. I think you're fine. Keep going.
Okay, okay. So as I said, I think my parents, and this is so I think preschool is an appreciated aspect of education. I feel like the laying out of the foundations of the culture of learning. I'm not talking about ABCs, one, two, threes. I'm talking about what it means to sit quietly in a seat during a lesson, what it means to work with other children in a group during a lesson, what it means to disagree or to be wrong. These are some of those basic components of learning. And I think individuals that receive a good preschool education really benefit the most from what that stage in learning has to offer. For me, again, to highlight, this is my mom over here. It's a picture of her, one of the last pictures she took before she passed away. Um, and she's sitting quite literally on the edge of the Grand Canyon. And Yeah, that picture always speaks to me. And down here is a picture of my father, who has always been extremely spiritual. I don't know if anyone out there has ever heard of the Baha'i faith, but my father is a practicing Baha'i, and he's been a Baha'i since I was born, basically. And so those two things, my mom's steadfast desire to overcome the obstacles in her upbringing, which were quite frankly significant, and combined with my father's gentleness and focus on others, I have to say that I didn't fully understand the impact that this would have on me as I would begin progressing through education, but that they certainly made a difference. So I don't know if any. Again, I'm going to be 51. Many of you probably remember this concept from the 1970s, definitely 1980s. The idea of track testing, somewhere between fifth and sixth or seventh grade, you'd end up taking some sort of state level test. And that test would then determine whether you ended up in gen ed or regents courses, or if you did really well, you'd end up in AP courses. For me, track testing was perhaps the closest I will ever come to winning the lottery. Track testing is what helped me, or what identified me as being gifted. That was the term being used back then. I don't know if it's still being used now, but being identified as gifted in third grade opened up doors for me that to this day still pay off. For instance, I was one of the first kids in my elementary school that got to go over to the middle school and look at the brand new room of Apple IIc computers, the first computer lab in my county. Things like that. And it was a really important step for me intellectually, and ultimately, as it would turn out, academically and professionally. But I have to say that it also is really where the racial divisions within education became solidified for me. So now that I was being tracked and I was ending up in these AP courses and Regents courses, I was taking advanced placement classes, so on and so forth. I became the original token. I was the number of classes I was in where I was the only African American, I can't even count. Um, I I never and I have done this count in my entire academic career, and yes, I am talking from kindergarten to graduating with a PhD. I had two black teachers the entire time. Neither one of them were actually ever in my discipline, political science. And to be even further direct, one of them was African American and the other one was actually African. And for those that might not understand, there is a very big difference between being African and African American. And so, in all honesty, as much as I benefited from being tracked as gifted early on, what it did was it really very clearly began to separate the idea of my white friends from my black friends, white role models from black role models. And what it ultimately did is really because of that, it created at least a perception that success was white, especially success within the academic environment. The only people I ever saw who were successful in school were white, and so in a very real sense, I had to start to ask questions. You know what? That's probably not the fairest way to say it. I started to have questions, but I did not feel like I was in a position to ask them. That's probably a better way to put it. Um, I knew that there were differences. I knew that if I went over to my white friends' houses after school, that I was going to have a decidedly different experience than if I went back to my own neighborhood and hung out with my black friends. And I have this term up here, a culture of learning, cost benefit analysis. There are things from elementary school, middle school, and even high school to a degree that, looking back again on it, I now see as being potentially vitally important to my education. And the irony is they had very little to do with actual lessons or assignments in a class. And so, for instance, um, I still remember the heartbreak of not being able to afford to go on the trip abroad. And I don't think race in and of itself is the primary variable for explaining the disadvantages of blacks within the education system. What it does is race has been translated to socioeconomic issues that then directly impact African Americans' ability to engage the education system and the opportunities it offers. In other words, there becomes a much steeper cost benefit analysis for engaging your kid in the very things that the education system is offering them, whether it's a trip abroad or being able to pay for your kid to have all the tools that he needs to join a baseball team, or let alone being able to take time off from work to go and watch your kid play the game. These are the sorts of things that I noticed that I was missing out on. And not just that I was missing out on, I'll be honest with you, it wasn't the school stuff. The school stuff to me was hitting off a T. I mean, that was the easy part of it. It was all of the other things that the students seemed that, especially my white friends, seemed to be getting out of the education that I just didn't seem to be able to reach. I didn't seem to be able to get my hands around. And so in the end, the reality was is that I feel like because of the advantages I got, because of being tested certain ways, and we could talk about the degree to which many of my black friends believed that I was getting advantages for no other reason, but I was biracial, and that colorism really becomes an issue during this time period, wherein there is a push for diversity, there is a push for increased inclusion of African Americans within all these different systems dynamics in the 1970s and 1980s. But the reality is that there were still very deep-seated racist components to those systems. And so at the time, one of the thoughts was, well, we'll select African Americans who are more palatable to the white community. And so that's the niche I found myself increasingly filling. Again, I didn't know it at the time. I just thought, hey, yeah, I can go on this trip. Hey, yeah, I can go to this conference. I'll go. And it didn't occur to me that I was being selected, at least partially because I was going to be able to fill a slot or check a box, while at the same time not threatening too much other people's perceptions of whether or not I should be there in the first place. In the end, and this is one of those recent uh, uh, realizations, if you will. In the end, the issue I was confronting and throughout high school was assimilation or empowerment. Were these education opportunities empowering me as an African American, giving me greater opportunity, allowing me to reach my own personal heights and satisfy my own goals? Or was in some way was I being asked to be less black in order to receive these opportunities? I mean, to be very clear, I was that kid that got all the time, oh, you're so well spoken, oh, you're so well mannered, and these were all those catchphrases back in the day with, but most blacks aren't, dot dot dot. And I was that kid, I mean, and one of the things about now working in an HBCU that I've really had to confront is what I believe are an enormous number of false narratives associated with racism in this country, and the fact that both black and white Americans have become victims of those narratives. The idea, for instance, that speaking a certain way represents whiteness is a false narrative. It's a false narrative that not only has allowed certain groups to gain power, but it's created within other groups a certain aversion to that power because they believe that to do so, to learn how to speak or to write well, suddenly is a demonstration of their lack of blackness or their assimilation. And so these are dynamics that I just was not aware of when I was going to school. Um, and for me, it was just taking every opportunity I could, or at least I thought. But the reality is, and the tumble. By the senior year in high school, again, another issue for the 1980s. I'm very open and honest about who I am, where I've been, and the things I've done. And so it's important for you guys to know that, for instance, I am a recovering addict. I've been clean and sober now for 27 years. And a lot of that all began in my junior and senior year of high school. I don't know if anybody remembers the mid to late 1980s, but we had an epidemic called the crack epidemic. And you can watch things and read things about the opioid epidemic today, and it's definitely horrible in terms of just how wide an impact it's having on American societies and communities. But the crack epidemic was a focused laser on the African American communities. It destroyed African American communities and families overnight, and I got caught up in that. I mean, to paint a picture, you have to understand. I'm going to AP, which is Advanced Placement Machines. Once I finish the high school course, I get college credit. I'm taking AP Biology and Chemistry back to back, sixth to seventh period of my senior year. I take the classes. I'm doing well. I put the books in my locker. I go across the street and I pick up my package from my dealer and I go out to the corner, and that's how I spend the rest of my night. And that was that time. It was a dark time. It was a dark time, and um, unfortunately for my family, as my mother's and father's professional careers picked up, they just weren't able to give me the same level of oversight, the same level of guidance. And so I made some horrible decisions, including getting addicted to drugs and ultimately dropping out of high school. I look back on those times, and I actually was just honored with as a speaker to the local Council for Drug-Free Youth, their yearly banquet. And I was trying to explain to them that um, the price of drugs, my price for drugs was 10 years. I lost 10 years of my life. I did not get to where I needed to be until I was about 28. And so, as proud as I am of where I am now and the things I've developed, um, I also know that I lost time, and I lost time because of the pit I fell into. And I don't know how much of that has to do with race directly, but I do know it has to do with socioeconomic backgrounds and the places I lived and the groups that I was running with. And so all of that is part of this story. So I'm working at a Ground Round. I don't know if anybody's ever heard of that restaurant. That's, again, I'm dating myself here. Cooking chicken wings on Monday Night Football for Ground Round. 20 years old, no high school diploma, and I've become friends with my manager at the restaurant, and he says to me, I'll never forget it, "You're too smart to be this stupid." And I was offended at first, because obviously I didn't understand where he was coming from. But I tell you, in hindsight, that was the kick in the pants. I got the GED that spring. That fall, I was enrolled at Dutchess Community College. And Dutch Community College is a small local college in 2-year college in Poughkeepsie, New York. And I, the only way I can put it is it saved my life. Within a year starting college, I was dry and working on a sober life. I was moving forward academically. I was finding my feet. I had actually started as an architectural engineer major. I love science. I've always been fascinated by physics and uh, theoretical physics in particular. But then I took this course called Model United Nations, in which I was taught how to represent a country at the UN, and then they put us on a bus and we went to the United Nations in New York, and for a week I was that country's ambassador. And I had never found anything in my life that seemed to allow me to bring all my skills to bear at the same time. And quite literally, halfway through that first semester, I switched from architectural science to political science, and 4 degrees later, that's how I ended up where I am here. One of the early things that I recognized, even within Model UN, especially as I moved forward under undergraduate work into my graduate work, was that certain disciplines are extremely homogenous. Lack of diversity really significantly impacting what you experience when you're not only researching and working within that discipline, but then ultimately teaching it. So, political science, it became very clear very early on that not a lot of African American males go into political science. And the higher I went in my degree search, the more that became evident. So that by the time I got to grad school, and again, I went to grad school at the State University of New York in Albany, Rockefeller College. So we're talking some 40 some odd thousand students. Okay. I was the only African American in my grad program for the first 3 years. The entire time I was in the grad program, there was never another African American student. And what happened for me personally was it just so happened that I also got married about a year before I started grad school. And so between my age and the race issues, and I I excelled. I was a killer grad student, but I was a killer grad student because I had nothing to distract me. I had no social commitments. It was just do the work. No, I wasn't going to go out on a Friday night with the young 22-year-old grad students and have a pint. It just wasn't where my life was at. Um, and so I guess in a certain way you could say it benefited me because I was able to put my foot in a lot of different worlds without having to necessarily commit to any one of them. But at the same time, increasingly throughout my education, I felt a little isolated. I felt like I was I mean, I was on a well-traveled pond, but I was certainly in a boat by myself, and I wasn't always sure how to bring those things together. I remember my first day of grad school. Literally, I went to go visit my who would become my mentor. Takes me across the street after I meet the secretary, we grab a piece of pizza, and the first thing he tells me is, "Well, 50% of all marriages fail during graduate work." And so, yeah, I brought that little gem home to my wife. She was not too thrilled about that. I'm not sure why he would tell me that, but the other thing is he's asking me what my research areas are and what my interests are. And I thought, well, I've the bit of international relations work and research I did as an undergrad, it just strikes me that there's never any real discussions of race in international relations. And he was very blank and said, well, we don't study race in international relations. That is a decidedly American politics issue. And so again, I found myself being kind of put in these pigeonholes from a racial perspective. I mean, to the point of I'm suddenly I'm suddenly considering how objective I could truly be in my own research. It's I try and tell my male students in terms of understanding race. Do you think it'd really be possible to study gender without ever considering yourself as a male? And that same question I think goes out when we're talking about studying race is how are we able to kind of pull a veil of ignorance over our eyes and understand these concepts from a truly objective state? Or is it virtually impossible for us to ever remove our own racial identities from what we see as race, whether it's in our lives or the things to study or the things that are our understandings? And so for me, what I started to realize was that as much as I thought as much as race seemed to fall away to a degree as I moved up the ladder, I also recognized that it fell away in what I call inside the ivory tower. Race become less and less an issue because there just simply was none of us to make it an issue. So my first conference was the International Studies Association conference in uh, in New Orleans, actually the year before Katrina hit, and I'm staying at the hotel literally right downtown New Orleans. I'd never been really that far south, let alone to New Orleans before. And first and foremost, again, and I please understand, and those that know me, I am not prone to hyperbole or exaggeration. I'm not trying to make some sort of effect here. Understand when I tell you, even at this conference in New Orleans, I was the only African American on the conference billet. And it was, I mean, when I remember going to there was kind of a mixer where I got to meet. I mean, I basically met the 12 apostles version of international relations theorists at this mixer. I was just mouth open, shaking hands, like I just read your book. I just read your last article, and there were no people of color. There were especially no professors of color in the room, and it really became obvious to me that, as I refer to myself now, that I was like a rainbow unicorn with like glittery wings. I was like the rarest thing in the world, an African American male studying an advanced degree in political science. And I guess for me, what suddenly became apparent was, did that come with certain responsibilities? Did I suddenly have a responsibility to focus in on giving back to my community and giving back to African Americans through education? Or, like all other non-African Americans, did I have the right to pursue my own interests, my own goals, and not feel some deep responsibility to my own group simply because of my color? Um, I guess for me, so you'll see in the picture here, in the middle picture, this is my first kind of real school. It was Union College in Schenectady, New York. This place was the picture of the small liberal arts school. I was convinced when I walked, it was like even a more elite version of Vassar College, if that was at all possible. And I mean, this place was just amazing. I was convinced that every time I walked through the front gates, the birds chirped a little bit louder. It was just everything was perfect at this place. It was just an amazing learning environment. Um, I need to, it was looking back on it, not only did I not receive even a modicum of racism in any way, shape, or form from the school, they actually went out of their way to reverse that, to make me feel as comfortable as possible. Now, at that time, I was trying to finish my PhD. I had a 2-year-old, or I had a new 2-year-old, and my oldest was getting older. It was crazy hectic at work, or at home and work, so I couldn't really take advantage of some of the opportunities. But I look back on that as it was just the most idyllic understanding of education, that I to this day, I when I left that school, I knew A, I wasn't ready for it. I didn't have the publications. I just got my PhD. There was no way I was going to get a full position. But B, I also knew that was the best job I was going to have. And to this day, it's still true. It was amazing what that school was able to do. Now, now that I've moved on to an HBCU, I have to admit I look at the school differently. So this last picture down here, that's the school that I'm teaching at now, Lincoln University. If you look in this middle picture, this somewhat long, large 4-story building in the center. Oops, I just messed that up. This long building right here, that's their new science building. It was completed about 2 years ago at the cost of $93 million. Okay, just their science building. The annual budget of my entire university is $33 million a year. And when I started to really think about my experience as an educator, the inequality represented by these two pictures became frankly overwhelming, staggering, in the sense of what I was able to provide for my students at this school versus what I can't provide at my students at this school. I was given $28,000 a year to run my Model UN program at Union College. My budget for Model UN at Lincoln University is $1,800. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. If you compare everything from ACT scores to graduation rates to retention rates, in many ways, this is the difference. This is the divide. This is the inequality in our education system. And again, I have to stress, there are Black students and Black faculty at this school. There are white students and white faculty at this school. The fundamental difference between the two is how, frankly, the legacies of segregation created inequalities within education that to this day permeate the systems that we're talking about. And they create incredible barriers for African American students in particular to not just succeed, but to actually even get to the opportunities that frankly many white students in America take for as an automatic or take for granted. I'll end with this thought and some various, well, a couple different thoughts and kind of summaries and conclusions that I've developed over this last 2 years at Lincoln. So first, I didn't really understand the term PWI, which stands for predominantly white institution. I certainly had never heard it used in any formal sense until I came to Lincoln University. And then once I was given the definition and asked to explore the concept, I am a product of PWIs. Everything I am, every place I've worked up until now, every place I've gone to school up until now would be PWI. And what does that mean? Well, it means I mean, as much as obviously it's got a racial connotation in the title, the deeper issues are the economic support, the opportunities that the education system itself represents relative to what I'm now seeing at the HBCU. Um, the the way that I summarize it, and again, I've been teaching for a long time. It didn't occur to me until I came to Lincoln that we all understand education. I think at least most of us that are brought up in your standard culture of education understand it as a path to success. That we're all engaging education on some level because we want to find out what we're good at, what we're not good at. Maybe we're going to be good enough at this. Somebody's going to give us a paper set. Other experts look at us and go, you know what? They're pretty good at that. That's our path to success. Um, Students at my HBCU, I'm telling you, it's about a path to survival. It's about this is the only way they know that they're going to get out of the neighborhood, out of the terrible environment that they're in. And so they come to the school and they're not coming from a gifted program. They're not coming from schools with massive amounts of support and high quality professors. This is the most important. They are not coming from families with a lineage of educational success that then provides for them the model that they can carry forward. In other words, The fact that they just got into school is a sign of survival. And the idea of having to do additional work and assume additional responsibilities now that you're there is almost onerous. The idea that I'm going to do homework and do 3 hours of reading after classes, and why would I do all that? My point is, I'm here. I survived. I made it to the next level. Isn't that enough? And I see this distinct difference. That's the biggest difference I've come to realize. Is this idea of success versus survival. And for instance, COVID has really accentuated that because, as many of you know, online education really flips the script when it comes to academic skills. In-class education works because the teacher's right there to help you when you don't have the motivation or the understanding. Online education really relies significantly on the students being self-motivated. And when you're talking about having to switch an entire year's curriculum online to students who frankly didn't know why they were here in the first place, let alone motivated enough to do all the work necessary to succeed. If I started telling you guys about some of my dropout rates, some of my failure rates, you'd be horrified. You'd ask, fairly so, how are we still open? And I guess in many ways that brings me to the final point being, I don't think in this country we do not have a full grasp of how deep the foundations of segregation were in terms of laying the foundations of our country's education system today. Um, and again, it is not just, well, now they're open. We're talking about a period in time in which HBCUs were created for no other reason but African Americans could not go to white schools. Now, at the time, it seemed like a move forward. Okay, at least there's some access to education. It's hard to explain to you what desegregation actually did to those schools in terms of marketing, in terms of the ability to be the sole source for truly gifted African Americans. So the reality is, I could offer full rides. I could have all sorts of amenities. How am I going to convince a truly gifted African American to come to Lincoln University beyond a Yale or a Harvard or an MIT? It's not going to happen. And so, ironically, desegregation actually undermined in many ways the foundations of HBCUs in this country. And so now what we end up with are many HBCUs or even just smaller community colleges in general struggling with the legacies of segregation and what they did to the understanding and the culture of education within minority populations. So that's basically my spiel, my little tap dance there.
Okay. Well, so we have a question from Victor Hahn. And so I invited Victor to ask the first question.
Yes, thank you, Darius. My question is, are you still seeing African Americans having difficulty in pursuing their education work dreams? Has it gotten better since you graduated from school? I mean, you're a great person to talk to about this because you've got a unique perspective of seeing both sides of the black and white coin, so to speak.
Well, I guess I would say there's kind of two answers there. I think that it's absolutely become easier for African Americans who succeed into four-year colleges or even move on to advanced degrees. I think the metrics for success have improved there. The problem is that we're still lagging in those pathways to that success. In other words, okay, and actually, thank you for bringing that up because it's something I want to talk about. Another dynamic that I grew up with was I grew up in the heyday of the affirmative action debate. And I remember being struck by many ways because I was literally in the middle of it. And to bring this around, so I applied for the visiting instructor position at Union College. I purposely didn't check the race box. In my mind, I wanted to be hired because I was a damn good professor, not because they thought I was going to fill some box. I get the position. First day in, one of the other professors sitting having lunch, and he looks at me and goes, "Are you crazy? Why would you not check that box? That's the only advantage that you guys have. Check that box every time." And it just struck me that it was a white colleague that was so kind of, he was actually a little angry with me having not taken advantage of that. And what struck me was I like the idea of affirmative action. I believe that education is the quickest way to equalize some of the racial issues we have in our country. And I think as a result of that, giving some sort of incentives or advantages to African Americans within the education system would accelerate that process. That said, I think affirmative action is too late. I think that by the time you're trying to help graduating seniors get into college and get into good colleges. They've already manifested the broad number of skill sets to get there anyway. So if they don't get into USC because of affirmative action or this or that, they're still going to get opportunities for other four-year institutions. Where we really need affirmative action is at the preschool level. Systems that help get African Americans into the culture of education as early as possible, so that when your middle and high school testing comes along, they've already developed the skill sets to do well on an SAT or on an ACT. But if you're trying to help them 3 months before they take that test, now let's figure out how to get you into college, man, that's way too late in my opinion.
We have another question from Dan Silva.
Hey, Darius.
Hey, Dan, how you doing?
Very good. How are you?
It's been a while, buddy.
Cool. I'm curious if you've had an opportunity to speak at Union College, either live or on Zoom, about your experience and your path to Lincoln, and if so, what you shared, and if not, what you would share with all those the students, faculty, and administrators.
Thank you. Good question. It's funny. I feel like I'm at. So again, I had 10 years of my life where I just made a lot of mistakes, and frankly, a lot of my education and professional development has been trying to move past them. I don't want to say forget them necessarily, but put them in the rearview mirror, if you will. And so I haven't been home in 10 years. I haven't been home since the day of my mom's funeral in Poughkeepsie. And so I haven't visited, I haven't connected really. Ironically, I haven't connected with any of my former colleagues at Union College. I still have at least 24 former students who are Facebook friends of mine. The Model UN program there was one of my greatest successes. I was able to actually create an award-winning program, won awards every year, including the top awards the final year I was there. And so those students are all really still very close to me. But that said, I am also, like I said at the beginning, I'm starting to find that point in my life where, you know what, the past is the past. And if I can use that to start to make some sort of, if I can help others as a result of my past, then why not? And so one of the things I'm actually engaged in right now with some former alumni of my high school is trying to set up an alumni mentoring program for my former high school. Because I remember the day I dropped out. It took 15 minutes. I'll never forget that. My parents were both at work, so I quite literally was dropped off at school by a friend of mine. I had already left home. I go into the principal's office. They tell me to go to the guidance office. Guidance counselor looked at me and said, "You ever thought of the military?" I was like, "No, not thinking about it right now." He said, "Okay, go ahead and sign." And I was out of school in 15 minutes. And it's those sorts of experiences that have led me now to track back around and do what I can to try and make sure that that doesn't happen in future Poughkeepsie High School alumni. And what's interesting is I feel like I'm okay. Like I've had some successes and stuff, and man, the people I'm working with, their CVs and resumes, holy cow! I'm the guy running out for coffee, I think, But if I can still help out and give something, I'm willing to do that. And so, this very well your question may very well be the thing that actually makes me reach back. Because I am still in contact with the chair of the department. She was just amazing, probably one of the best supervisors I've ever had, academically or professionally. So I still have a good relationship there. And I think if I was to put this in a narrative, I think they'd appreciate it. And to follow up what you're saying or what you asked, I think I'm right at the point now where it's time to write a book. So those are my thoughts.
Very cool.
Well, our next comment comes from Tracy Zace.
Hey, Rick, thank you. And Darius, thank you so much for sharing your story. It's really inspiring. I don't know, if it's so much a question, but I have been inspired lately by reading Agnes Callard. She makes really good observations about what we call meritocracy, which is an amorphous type of thing that leads me to think we need to re-examine what we believe people are deserve or earn or are owed in our society, because I think that leads to a lot of this inequity that you're talking about. Secondly,
Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead and comment on that. The other thing I just wanted to ask is, did you pursue international relations, and did you find a link to race in international relations?
So
Before you respond to that question, could I ask you to exit your share screen
Sure,
so everybody can see more participants on it? Thank you.
absolutely.
Thank you very much.
So the first thought, and I'm sorry, it was, did I find race in international relations?
Well, you said that you wanted to study international relations in your thesis, and your advisor told you, oh, no, we don't talk about race in international relations.
Yeah. Well, it's been interesting because frankly, one of the things that, and this is a nod to Dr. Spivak here. I am a passionate student of history, global history especially, but also American history in particular. And so what's been interesting is, I guess you could say, I have found race in international relations, but it's been much more from a comparative standpoint. Um, what I mean by that is, like, for instance, this term, one of the courses I was teaching was African politics. And interesting story about that. African politics, uh, it forced me to really begin to engage narratives, quite frankly, that have been developed mostly from Western perspectives. And with regards to African history and politics, one of the key issues is that most African history and politics has been passed down through a verbal narrative. So there's no written record. And so the written things we know about African politics have been written predominantly by Westerners, specifically Western explorers, imperialists, and colonialists. And so while I haven't necessarily incorporated a direct racial component, if you will, into international relations research, it's very interesting. I'm sure several of you have probably had experiences outside the country. Race in America is unique. Our understanding, our interactions, or even our very definitions of race in America are unique to just about every other society you can talk about. It doesn't mean other societies don't have racial issues, but it's just the degree to which race in particular in this country really, well, to be frank, the way I say it is the African American is the most unique uh, identity in the United States. The African American identity is the only one that has been solely created within the context of American culture. Every other hyphenated identity that we could discuss, from Irish American to Chinese American, brings with them some sort of pre-established, pre-existing, and here's the important part, easily referenced legacy or history that no matter how much that individual might have their own issues with identity, they can still look back on those precursors to understand who they are and where they came from. The African American does not have that in any way, shape, or form. I go as far as to explain, why is the African American the only one whose hyphenated identity uses a regional marker rather than a specific national marker? Because the national identity or origins of African Americans really don't make sense. It doesn't apply because we can't trace those things in the same way as the other lineages in our country. And so what's interesting, like when, for instance, I study and teach about the Cold War, is how much issues of race relations in the United States became commingled with socialist political movements within the African context to create Pan-Africanism. So I mean, there's definitely places there, but it's just never been, frankly, race in international relations is like Africa in international relations. It's a footnote. It's just never considered as a primary area of focus or research.
But this hyphenated American comment, I think, leads back to the question of, what is this thing that we call meritocracy? It's the pros and cons of our unique experiment here. We start out with beliefs about who deserves, who earns, who owes, are owed things that we don't even recognize in ourselves. But yet the upside is the theory that you have the ability to earn whatever you can through talent and giftedness. I don't know.
No, I listen. So the example I use when discussing that very concept is World War II. I'm sure you're all familiar that World War II is often seen, and it has been directly called the greatest generation. The sacrifices, the victory, everything that goes with American victory in World War II is, by just about every measure, seen by most as the high point of Americans' idealism, America's leadership, so on and so forth. My own studies, and I mean, I've been watching, I remember being a little kid and watching the grainy documentaries, World at War on PBS on the weekends, and just being fascinated by how impactful that whole period of time seemed to be, especially for Americans. And it strikes me that what you're discussing really applies to that generation in particular. It's a paradox. On the one hand, to look at what the veterans of World War II accomplished and not pay them homage or deference and respect for what they accomplished would be unfair. It's clear that without the sacrifices of that generation, that quite literally, fascism might still be around. And at the same time, and this is the bottom line, how much credit do you give someone for winning a race when two people that might have won it were not allowed to run? And that's the dilemma. I personally look at World War II as perhaps one of the greatest missed opportunities to fix race in America that ever existed. Okay. If African Americans had been allowed to fight in World War II, they then would have been allowed to develop what we now see as a legacy within many white families as to the sacrifices and the advantages that they gained because of those sacrifices from World War II. And the key, GI Bill. I can't help but think that if African Americans had had the same access to the GI Bill and knowing what it did for the literal creation and development of what we know as the suburb today, for the amount of economic advancement that it created in the 1950s and 1960s, if African Americans had been allowed to not only gain in the cultural benefits of having fought in the victory of World War II, but then the economic benefits associated with the GI Bill, I think our very understanding of meritocracy, the idea of white privilege, any of those concepts would be fundamentally different today. I think it was a missed opportunity.
Well, our next question comes from Carrie Winter.
All right, thanks, Rick. I do have a question, but I just want to make a comment here. I really appreciate your talking about your story and your experiences. I think it brings your experience alive in terms of people's understanding here. I agree with your comment about the GI Bill. I thought about that myself, and you go back there and you think about the advantages the GI Bill provided for those who were able to take advantage of it. It was kind of a foundational thing for the 50s and the 60s, I think, in terms of people's advancement. But in any event, my real question is, you mentioned and illustrated the difference in investment and budgets between Union College and Lincoln, and illustrated it in terms of investment in buildings and so on. Is there, in your view, a long-term solution to that kind of disparity? And clearly it has been the case for a long time. But what's a long-term solution here? Are we talking about a whole reconstruction of educational institutions? Is it a matter of governmental investment? Is it a matter of attitude? I mean, is there a long-term solution to all of this?
Well, I think I guess the idealist in me has to believe that there's a solution. And if there is, it's absolutely long term. From my perspectives, I guess there are a couple of issues. And I need to be perfectly clear. Like, I like to just kind of try and throw it out there, be as honest as I can about what I'm thinking and my perspectives, and then let the chips fall where they may. And I should be honest and tell you folks that some of my perspectives on HBCUs are not necessarily perspectives that are agreed upon by my colleagues. And so one of the paradoxes that I've noticed coming here, and it kind of relates to your question, is the HBCU itself. On the one hand, the HBCU is perhaps the single most important symbol of the African American culture in the United States today, in terms of its empowerment of African Americans. It's serving as a beacon for opportunity and hope during the deepest parts of segregation, even right after Civil War and during Reconstruction. The dilemma I see is that importance was built upon the reality of segregation. And so now you have this real dilemma within the HBCU community, because quite frankly, the level of middle and upper class Black elites that would turn those institutions and have turned those institutions into African American versions of your Ivy League or your advanced institutions, that's a limited population. And so many HBCUs are now struggling because they're competing with open enrollment institutions, your local community college, a whole host of other schools that might not have actually ultimately brought these students in during segregation. And so I guess one of the issues I see is the HBCU framework itself. I mean, if you want to go even deeper, I don't know how many people are aware or familiar with the history of HBCUs, but most of them find their origins in what's called the land grant program. The idea that we're going to use large, massive federal funds to develop African American schools for newly freed slaves to go and educate themselves. Well, what's interesting is the individuals that were pursuing radical reconstruction at the time did understand that African Americans did not have the educational background to then go into the same types of schools, for instance, that white Americans in the Northeast had been pursuing. And so the development of the land grant program, what you end up with is a focus on the land, specifically agricultural sciences. And that's all well and good in 1880 and 1890 as the foundation of the economic betterment of African Americans. But in the age of STEM, to put this in perspective, the agricultural sciences program at my university is better funded by a factor of 10 than any other program at the university. It has so much funding that it goes unused from term to term, even if the university itself has some financial difficulties. That money, because of the way it would, and we are talking in Missouri, we're still going back to 1880s, 1890s legislation here. It cannot be used for anything other than agricultural sciences. And so what you do is even the programs that were developed to try and broaden opportunities, they really were pigeonholed at the time because of things like technology and the nature and social and industrial development of our country. If you're asking me what the solution is, we need to go into that. We need to go deeper into not the money, but where is it being provided? And for me, I still even go further back and argue for every HBCU, there should be a preschool program. That the idea of developing strong preschool programs within African American communities, to me, that is a no brainer. If you're going to put money somewhere, combine it with, and I mean, to me, the real dynamic way to approach it would not just be about preschool, but about family development. So at the same time, the kids getting preschool engagement, why not have the parents getting learning life skills, money? I mean, the most basic things that we take for granted in the middle class society are real struggles for some of these other students and minority groups. In terms of the future and how we're going to make this better, another aspect, and I don't know, this is a tough one. I wrote an article actually called "From the Black Reconstruction to the Black Reformation." I'm sorry, from reparations to reformation. Um, I look at the whole idea of reparations as being about 150 years too late. I think it's I call it the impossible necessity. There is no way in God's green earth this country could ever roll out reparations for African Americans, either economically or socially. I mean, you want to talk about opening a can of worms, the next thing that would happen is how do you define African American? Boom, there you go. Major issues, right? To me, it's not about reparations in the sense of giving money to existing groups of African Americans as much as making sure that money is available to pursue certain things. So earmarking that money for education or for business development or for neighborhood development, that to me is the approach to go there. Okay. A second component of that, and this is to me, this is the statistic I give my kids. If you want to understand the legacies of segregation and racism in this country, all you need to do is look at property disbursement. White Americans own 97.6% of all private property in the United States. African Americans own 0.8%. If you want to understand why African Americans as a community continue to lag significantly behind, it's that. It's that disparity, especially when we all understand that from the founding of this country, property has always been what's made the man. And so to not have property in a community continues to hinder the ability to, for instance, take out loans, leverage assets to develop community businesses. It's just, if you don't have those foundations, you can't then move forward. And so in the end, you end up with African American communities hoping that their neighboring white communities help them out or support them. And that's just, when you're putting African Americans in that position, especially within educational systems, it's bound to end up with recriminations and ineffectiveness and inefficiency. but I might have gotten off topic there a little bit.
That's what we love about you, Darius.
Sorry, man. I'm just running at the mouth here.
You're doing great. Our next question comes from Tony. And Tony, I don't know how to enunciate your last name. Can you say your last name for us?
Well, the last name is Staup, S-T-A-U-P. I don't know why it's a 5-letter word that most people can't pronounce. I've never been able to figure that out. This is really an interesting discussion. My question to Darius is, first of all, Thomas Sowell is my touchstone for just about any thought process that I seem to be confused on. But I've read and listened to Thomas Sowell's opinion of education protocols. His contention seems to be that it's not as much a racial divide, but a function of lessening of higher standards of disciplines. His examples are his experiences in New York City schools and the history of predominantly Black schools in Washington, D.C. So I'm interested to know what Darius's reaction to Dr. Sowell's opinions and observations are on what he sees to be a fundamental racial issue. And it's really cross racial. It's a fundamental education issue that we just aren't tough enough on kids.
Well, and again, see one of the aspects of being tough, one of the aspects of being tough begins with an understanding that the lack of achievement amongst students or whoever you're being tough on is simply a matter of them not being pushed hard enough. What it doesn't take into account is the degree to which the individual might be way tougher than you think and simply not have the skills, capacity, or understanding to achieve what you're pushing them towards. So I say that because I have been at, with the exception of Union College, to be perfectly honest, with the exception of Union College, every university I've ever worked at some point, moving towards what I refer to as the lowest common denominator in education is always a tension. It's always a force to be reckoned with. Because here's the dilemma. Am I tough on them? And suddenly, how do I then explain 50% failure rates? How do I explain declining enrollments every term? How do I explain to the student that I'm just being tough on them? That I'm just expecting something from them that everyone else is going to expect, especially when they haven't engaged that culture, when they don't understand. So we had some guys, the local law enforcement representatives come to Lincoln University last year before COVID. It was the ADA, it was members of the prosecutor's office, it was forensic specialist, it was a state trooper, just trying to give our students an understanding of what these different career paths offer to them. After the presentation, the lead speaker's trying to give out some cards, and most of the students just kind of, mildly thanked him and then filed out. And he seemed kind of, I don't understand. Why don't they want to follow up? Why don't they want more? And I was trying to explain to him that he needed to understand that as much as they might have been interested in what he was saying right in front of them, they had no frame of reference beyond him. They weren't going home to lawyers or prosecutors or highway patrolmen. They didn't have friends or family that could explain to them what it took for him to become a surgeon or any number of other positions. And so when I think about being tough, what I find is if you're the only one being tough, you're going to be the source of whatever negative reactions that toughness then brings out. And so as an educator, I notice that if I'm holding them to standards that they're not being held to anywhere else, they're going to be less inclined to hear me out and listen to me, not more inclined. And this is really important. Them not having received that from home is not necessarily a failure of their parents. Their parents may very well be doing everything they grew up learning how to do, were taught how to do, got out of their jobs. And that's the best they can do. I think many of us on this call take for granted the idea that if a student comes to our children come to us with, I need help on math or in English, that we can at least give it on some level. We take that for granted. I have students whose parents never got anywhere close to college. And so, the answer is Google it. And so now all of a sudden the student has to not just learn how to learn, but they have to do that learning on their own. They have to do all of them, engage all of those dynamics on their own. And so I guess I'm not one of the things about an assumption of a standard that you then should just push everybody towards is that it's assuming that standard was properly set. It's assuming that standard was set taking into account all of the considerations of the individuals that are then going to have to meet that standard. And as much as I do, as an educator and even on a personal level, I get the whole we could be a little tougher thing. Trust me. I've got students trying to turn in 5-page papers as snapshots off their phone, and then when I say that's not how you do a paper, then I'm the one not being flexible. So, I mean, I get it. But at the same time, to assume that they're not doing those things out of obstinance or out of some Gen X desire to resist, I don't think that's fair either. I think in the end, we have to look deeper and understand that many of them just might not know any difference.
Well, I think that's my point. I think I hear you saying that it's difficult because you may be, the lighthouse in the ocean. My contention is, and I think what I read from Dr. Soul is this is a broad-based problem in our education, not only in minorities, but across the.
I understand what you're saying.
Yeah, and somewhere that needs to get turned around.
So here's and this is a problem at HBCU, problem my own education background. Do we recognize the experiences and plights of the African American as being unique amongst students? Should we have some sort of national program that engages education beyond racial considerations and just understands, for instance, that there are socioeconomic issues that impact your ability to learn, or you're not being supported at home, and so we just need to make almost non-race-based frameworks and systems? I'll be honest. I mean, there's a part of that, again, as an educator, there's a part of that that makes perfect sense. I mean, I don't want to have to shift curriculum or assessment or even just basic understanding of my students based upon the color of my student. But I got to be honest with you, as an African American, having experienced all of those things, my experiences were somewhat unique. Okay, and they were unique not because of who I am, but because of the legacies that people like me have within this country. And that's what we are having a hard time dealing with. It occurred to me yesterday, and I've been hesitating putting this out on Facebook just because I'm not sure how many friends I'd lose, but it occurs to me that there's a great dilemma for white Americans in the United States today. The reality is the current generations of white Americans, as well as frankly probably the next 2 or 3, are going to be asked to bear the responsibility for the sins of your forefathers all the way back to the founding. For some white Americans, that is just unfair. For other white Americans, it's going to be a moment of awakening and a moment of reckoning and an epiphany. But for, I think, a large majority, it's a question of how much of this responsibility do I accept? I'm sorry that segregation negatively impacted the ability of African Americans to learn and to engage in our education system. But that's not my personal fault. And I'd like to see their parents take more responsibility and make things better. That's kind of what I see as the narrative today. And it's really, in many ways, the one group that loses out the most are the students, because we worry too much about who's going to accept responsibility over the evils of the past and the needs of the future without assessing what needs to be done today, without really putting aside our own biases and our own, I mean, I've got my own to this day. I just went through a new search because when I got hired at Lincoln University, both political science professors had ultimately left at the same exact time. So they literally had no political science professors. I throw in my application. It turns out that me and another African American political science professor, what do you know, 2 unicorns in the same herd, we get hired. I'm being honest, I'm in a position professionally where I needed to take what was in front of me. I was not doing well in Nebraska. I was not finding real opportunity in Nebraska. And professionally and personally, it was draining me. And so when the Lincoln University job came up, I jumped at it. And I feel like I feel like in the end, I made the absolute right choice, but I'm not going to sit here and pretend to you that I was waiting for the bigger and better deal. Why do I bring that up? My colleague who's now leaving, he was that guy. He is a quantitative theorist. He has the skills. He's got the PhD. He's got the pedigree. I mean, he is literally African American scholar that people inside DC are killing to get their hands on. And so he didn't have the same incentive to stay, and he's leaving. And it's unfortunate because I think he was exactly the sort of person that the school needs. Now, that said, we got 24 applications, and none of them were African American. 2 of them were Africans who had never actually stepped foot in the United States, which ultimately I thought was problematic if you're teaching 2 sections of American government every term. But what struck me was that was it. Me and him seem to be the bottom of the barrel in terms of African American candidates. They're just one of the great issues that goes around at my university is that there's this periodic call. Why aren't there more African American professors? My university is actually unique amongst HBCUs because we're almost a 50-50 split for both faculty and students. We have 47% white students, 47% black, and actually the predominant number of faculty are white depending on the discipline. And there will be this call for, well, we need more black professors. And it's like there's not some magic club of black professors sitting around just waiting for the phone to ring. These individuals are in many ways snapped up before they ever get to the academic level, snapped up by businesses, snapped up by the government, because they're in such high demand, because they're so rare. And so that creates this other paradox of, even if we wanted to create uniquely African American approaches to education, how much are we going to have to rely on non-African Americans to deliver it? Should we be relying? Should a white professor be allowed to teach race and politics in America? Does it matter if it's an HBCU or not? It's funny, we don't often think of these things. We just kind of put them off to the side. But I'm telling you now, having been inside the tower, it is an issue to have a male teach gender politics, for instance. Okay, it is an issue, especially at an HBCU, to have white professors teaching African American politics to a predominantly African American class. And so these are the sorts of things that I didn't really fully understand, having been so long in the PWIs, because, well, of course, Darius is going to teach the African American politics course. Actually, it was the only course. Here's quick. It was the only course that I bombed at Union College. Literally, my 4.5 years there, it was the only course that did not go well. Here's why. I show up, and I'm a political scientist. I'm just trying to get through my work and my discipline. I'm a new visiting instructor. Because there were no African Americans on campus teaching, when they heard there was an African American teaching African politics, every black student in the damn school signed up for the course. Not just that, but they're expecting me to show up in a dashiki and be able to, to be able to properly pronounce every African name that's in the textbook. I had to disabuse them of that really fast. And suddenly, I was a failure. I was unable to bring what they understood to be the African American experience to an African politics course. And it made me suddenly aware that even my basic discipline has been defined by the PWI. Well, of course, African politics looks at the states and democracies. Why would you look at race and ethnicity and tribalism? That's not part of African politics as far as we understand it. And so that's been my real awakening and eye-opener. In the end, to be perfectly honest, I know I probably did not answer your question, Tony, but I'm not sure it can be answered in just a flat kind of, this is the answer, this is the solution. I think, I'll tell you right now, everything that we've talked about, this conversation and how it would create practical outputs into the community is going to be fundamentally different in New York versus Nebraska versus Missouri. As much as we're talking about education and race and the American experience, one of the things that I have definitely learned over the last 2 years or 10 years is that America is highly regionalized, and even things like race and education are further defined on a regional level. And so I apologize for not answering that question, but at the same time, I felt like it was really worth going into, because in many ways, it's kind of the fundamental paradox of where I'm at right now. How much should education be transformed or adjusted to take into account the the specific experiences of African Americans. You're right about the socioeconomic impacts across all of these dynamics. There's no doubt about that. A poor white student in southern Missouri is struggling with the same ABCs as my poor white student or poor black student in Jeff City. That's true. The difference is race has exaggerated that socioeconomic impact amongst African Americans at a level that doesn't exist in any other group in the United States. That's the difference. And if we don't figure that out, the inequality is going to continue to manifest.
Okay, our next question, and we're running low on time. We're down to about the 10-minute mark, is from Mike Meekin. Sorry, Mike.
Hey, thanks, Rick, and thanks, Darius. And Darius, you've touched on my question a couple times. It has to do with the value of early childhood education. And President Biden has made that a part of his infrastructure proposal now. So what I'm interested in your thoughts on is looking at that as a tax expenditure that really, that's an investment in people, and that investment has a positive return on investment.
Well, I think it would undoubtedly. I have at least one student a term, and she ends up failing out or no longer coming to class for no other reason but she can't get childcare. It's happened now at least once a term in the 2 years that I've been here. And when you consider the inability of single parents, of two-parent households, and they're working 3 jobs between the 2 of them, to then provide the sort of childcare, because in many ways it's not just about childcare, it's about that early education. It's about providing what I call the culture of education, just learning for the sake of learning. Even something as basic as being read a bedtime story at the end of the day, you start to then understand, hey, we read every day. And that's a really important dynamic. I've got students who I wonder if I could ever instill that in them now. I don't, like, the tree's grown to the way it's going to grow, and there's a certain point at which you can't straighten it back up, kind of thing. And so that's why I look at the early childhood education as being so critical, because I mean, you can really teach basic life lessons at that early age that will then inform their ability to learn so many other lessons down the road. And when you consider, frankly, that the problems and the inequalities, for instance, of young African Americans are most acute at those young ages where they're also having children, the idea of providing early childhood education along with more dynamic childcare and even community development programs, I think, again, to me, I'm glad to hear that President Biden's pushing it forward. I guess from my perspective, the question being what's taken so long. These are sorts of things that should have been working along.
Okay, so we got time for 2 more questions. The second to the last one is coming from Mike McDonald.
Yes, hi Darius. Just real quickly here. So I've been a member of this group for a long time. One of our speakers in one of our events here was Michelle Troxclair. You may have heard of her, and she's a media person in North Omaha, etc., and has done a lot of work in Omaha. And so she talked about the disparity. She's also from a mixed race marriage. She talks about the disparity of her 2 grandfathers' estates when they were settled by her economically. And I want to also mention that I worked for disaster relief after Katrina. I went down to the Gulf Coast of Mississippi 6 times. And I spent a significant amount of time in a community called Moss Point, Mississippi. And the reason that's significant is that's where Eddie Glaude Jr. comes from. And I know that community very well. And the fact that he is a representative from that community is distinct, has as much distinction as what you've discussed as you went through your educational progress. My wife was an educator in South Omaha, and my daughter is an educator in the Unified School District of LA in a predominantly Black elementary school. And I need to mention that Thursday she was awarded Teacher of the Year. And so education has been a really important background. Now, I was a business person. I was involved in business and a nonprofit, and I'm still involved in a nonprofit. My question is, Martin Luther King organized the Poor People's Campaign or the Poor People's March in Washington, D.C. in 1968. Have we made any significant progress on improving the effects of poverty and its effects on outcome?
Nope.
Well, it's interesting, I guess. So one of the things that I get into arguments with, especially with my sister, because we have some very different perspectives on this issue. I actually argue that one of the values of the civil rights movement and the work of people like Martin Luther King and what's come after is that I would maintain that systemic racism has been greatly reduced and in some places eliminated in America. Now, I say that, and it's very important for you to understand. When I say system, I'm very much talking about systemic theory, systemic structure, the idea of an objective system that each input creates a definite output. So, for instance, it is no longer the truth that no matter where you go, certain policing is going to end up with discrimination against African Americans. What I do believe we see in the continued issues is the legacy, the legacy of racism. It's the individual who continues to maintain narratives that they believe to be truth, acting within these systems in a racist manner that then creates the events that we're seeing. Why do I make that distinction? Because as soon as the racist act is discovered, the system kicks into place to punish it. Now, whether or not that punishment is just or adequate, whole different conversation. But I just don't see the same level of systemic racism, and thus I don't see as much of a direct connection between discrimination and segregation and the poverty amongst the African American community that maybe existed back in the 1960s and 1970s. In that way, yes, I do think we've made some strides. Where I think we haven't made as much is in the legacy part. In my mind, and I've got some writings that I've thrown out on this, basically the argument I make is as we've reduced systemic racism in this country, we have actually solidified and condensed the legacies of racism. The individuals that are desperate to hold on to the racial psychologies of the 1960s and past are those individuals now who are going to go marching with torches, singing we will not give in, we will not give them the land," or whatever it was. Right. And right, that's the legacy. And those individuals are becoming more and more emboldened within our society precisely because the systems of power that they could rely on previously no longer are paying out benefits to them that they used to be able to get. You can't take videos on your frat bus ride anymore and just pass them around and have it be what it's going to be. Somebody's going to leak it out. Suddenly you're kicked out. Suddenly the frat's no longer. There are repercussions now to racism. And so I think there are a lot of people who are retreating or at least no longer willing to engage it in the way they might have in the past. The difference is the individuals that are still willing to go down that road are now louder and more aggressive than they've been in the last 2 to 3 decades. And so that's my fear. I guess on the one hand, I do think things have gotten better, but there is a concern that there's a small component that are trying their hardest to make things worse.
So for our last question today is all the way from Brooklyn, New York, my good buddy, Mike Pope.
Hi, good morning. I just have a quick question. You gave a kind of a brief biography or autobiography, and you skipped over or you treated, I thought, fairly lightly a very significant point, and that is that you went from being a crackhead to getting your GED and ultimately getting to where you are now. How the hell did that happen? I mean, that is not an insignificant step to go from being 10 years.
It's funny. It brings out the paradox because on the one hand, I'm going to be honest with you, when I was standing in front of that council for drug-free youth, even 27 years clean, I still felt like a hypocrite. It is a constant source of embarrassment. The easiest way to put it is one day I was and one day I wasn't. I was always a binge addict. And if anybody knows anything about addictions, there's your daily addict, daily use addict, and there's your binge addict. And so I was a binge addict. I'd go 3-4 weeks, months, and then I'd get a certain paycheck, and then it was on, and I'd get myself in trouble. And education, there's something about suddenly having to make sure you don't embarrass yourself in front of the professor that's actually giving you crap. That made the difference. My mentor, by the second term I'm in his class, he made me a teaching assistant. How could I in good conscience show up blasted out of my head when he had that much faith in me and gave me that responsibility? And oh yeah, I'm also all of a sudden a role model to the other students. And so in a very literal sense, I never went to a rehab. It was just one day I was engaged in it, and the next day I just promised myself I'd never do it again. And
But don't
thankfully I
you?
never, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, but don't you think that even before then there must have been something that was instilled in you to even make that something important to you that you wanted to do well? I mean, my secret theory is that the fact that you had the experience as an honor student also gave you a certain sense of yourself, which might have sustained you or given you that self-esteem to be able to go through that period.
I
That's
would I'm going to be honest, the whole honor student thing, the good student thing, that was done by the beginning of my senior year. I was just going through the motions. Um, the truth is, and this is why when at my current university, compared to my previous schools, I talk about white students seeing university as a path to success, whereas black students see the university as a path to survival. And that was very much where I was. And truth be told, if you want to know bottom line, I probably was able to kick drugs because in the end I have got an incredible survival instinct. I will not go down without a fight. And it doesn't matter if it's a stupid little thing at a job or drugs or whatever it was. I'm going to make sure I'm fighting until the very end. And I started to realize that drugs were a fight that I was never going to win. Um, and if I wanted to survive, if I wanted to go on to my bigger and better things, that I better give that crap up. And so that's what it was. And then thankfully my wife came along, and I almost look at her as the payout. You know what I mean? It was she's just been a rock for me from the day we got married, from the day we met, basically. And so I can say in all truthfulness, I have not had any thoughts. I'm proud of the fact that I'm aware of who I am and where I've come from, but I'm also aware that that's in the past.
Awesome. Well, I mean that it's 10:04, so we've gone over time, but no surprise there.
Right.
I was going to ask Dr. John Spivak if he wanted to make a summary closing comment as we end our meeting.
A summary closing comment. Good God.
I think you're Darius's biggest fan.
I don't know.
That is true. That is true. As soon as I met Darius, I knew there was something. He was my brother from another mother. We had both spent a lot of time being on the outside looking in, and the pain that caused and the damage that does. And he overcame in a way that struck me as almost miraculous. I can't tell you how much respect I have and had for him, and I still do. He is the most honest human being I've ever met. When he says, I don't have the answer. I don't know what the solution is. Maybe it's beyond us. I mean, for me, everything comes down to tribalism, which I hate. And when they ask me what my race is, I always say earthling. But that's not the answer either. I think Darius has an incredible amount to offer, not only to his students, but to this country. And I wish I'd see him in public office.
That's my plan.
What?
That's my plan. I'm just trying to. I've been really deeply involved in the community around here. I actually
Yeah,
put together a local town hall program and some other things, and so I'm thinking 3 to 5 years.
good.
Got to have a plan.
One of the things that I'm most concerned about with Darius, are you happy?
You know, it's funny that you come around to that. I should say, in all honesty, and first again, I got to say, guys, I'm really kind of taken aback by the program you've put together here. There was a lot more honesty and openness and engagement here than I've seen in groups that have professed to be free speech or open-minded or avoiding arguments. And so off the top, I just want to really thank everyone for their engagement, because the questions are amazing and the back and forth was even better. It should, to be full honesty, my time in Nebraska was perhaps some of the worst time of my life. I've never felt more isolated politically or racially or even intellectually than I did in my time in Nebraska. And I need to be clear. This is not a knock on Nebraska. In fact, I say that with a sense of awe and jealousy. The way I used to tell my wife's from Nebraska, so if for anybody wondering why I ended up there, if you're from Nebraska and you're on the inside of the bubble, it is heaven. You know people, they know you. You can help each other out. The communities are nice and small. Hell, your mom knows my mom, and I mean, it's an amazing thing. But I'm not sure Nebraskans understand just how absolutely frightening that is when you're not from inside the bubble. And so, ironically, as we talk about race and education, my experiences at Bellevue University were first that race. It's the only place I've ever taught where race didn't matter amongst the students. Since everything's online, it's just about what are you producing. It's just race was quite literally never an issue with regards to my online instruction and teaching. But interestingly, race was most important amongst faculty and my colleagues at Bellevue University. It was very strange to be at a university that large and be the only African American professor for the first couple of years I was there. And wonder, when you hear some sort of off-color remark, should I speak up? Should I just, keep quiet? And I mean, it created a whole nother layer to the educational experience that went far beyond whatever I was trying to accomplish with my students. And so I say all that because um, I would not have made it there for the 8 years I was there without people like Rick Galusha and John Spivak. You played a pivotal role in just allowing me to express myself in ways that I just was not getting anywhere else. And that alone, that escape hatch, even if nothing came of it, was really vital to me maintaining who I am and what I ultimately got out of the job. So as much as you're throwing accolades my way, I should really say thank you to both Rick and John for helping keep me sane at that university.
And just so you know, Carla Carter's on as well.
Oh yeah, Carla, she'd definitely be the third one.
Well, so that concludes our meeting today. I appreciate everybody participating and being polite and asking good questions. And we'll have something for you the first Saturday of the next month in June. So with that, you're free to go or you're free to hang out, because I'm sure we're going to continue to talk for a while. Take care.
Thank you again, everyone. Thank you very much.
I'm staying.
How you doing, John?
In most things, reasonably well. I'm happy with Healy. We're living in Des Moines now because that's where the daughter and granddaughter live.
Right.
The finances are an issue and all sorts of stuff, but it's good still. It's good still need to be looking down at the grass.
I understand. I understand.
Yeah, but good God, I'm going to be 79 in a month. I didn't know things lasted that long. But there was a question I had that when you were talking about the experience for the Black students and your experience and the experience of other Black academics I've known, I was torn back to Du Bois and his notion of the talented 10th. And it seemed to me that and you'll excuse this accolade, for Black superstars, the sky's the limit. But for really good Black students, for really good people, it's still almost unchanged.
So I'm going to go a different. My bigger dilemma is that the Black superstar is increasingly not then seen as Black.
Yeah.
Okay, and this is a dynamic that I would need to look up the name. Just an outstanding book that I was reading about, basically the origins and evolution of the Black identity in America. And see if I can find the name of this book here. There you go. Stamped from the Beginning by Ibram Kendi. Last name Kendi. Stamped from the Beginning. Actually, John, you in particular would find this just an amazing read, because the in-depth historical research he does to support some of the discussions he offers is just fantastic. That said, one of the things that he talks about is the idea of Black exceptionalism, and the idea that during post-colonial period, prior to, for instance, the Civil War, the idea that an increasing number of African Americans were standing out, whether as poets or as orators or in a variety of different ways. And while they were being recognized by the white community, they were being recognized because they were unique, not a representation of the African American. And that still exists. It still exists. Now, one of the things that, again, coming to this HBCUs, I got to tell you, you want to talk about an eye opener, and I didn't talk about it much in the main discussion, but it's probably one of the most important realizations I've had since I came here. Up until coming here, I was as confident about my Blackness as you could get. I knew who I was. I knew if you didn't like it, that's a you problem, not a me problem. All right.
Yeah.
When I got here and I suddenly, for the first time in 50 years, had Black colleagues, had every course predominantly Black students, I was suddenly confronted with the idea that there is a fundamental difference in this country between being Black and being an African American. African American is a social political concept, a legal political concept, if you will, right? It's a box on the census. I have always been and will go into the ground being an African American. My Blackness, whole nother conversation, dude. No, you laugh, but I mean, it was to come to this environment, and I thought I was Black, and then have questions like, okay, so which church do you go to? Oh, wait, you're married to a Black woman or to a white woman? Your son is blonde haired, blue eyed? And the questions, ironically, the one that's been the biggest issue, the church. I never understood how important the church was to the definition of Blackness in the South. Never would have guessed that. And so there's been a part of me that I just haven't been able to engage. Like, I'm working with them Monday through Friday, no problem, but I'm not getting invites to the barbecue. Because you laugh, but I would literally be the only person not from the church. And then, so talking about the token, this is something that really I learned at this school. I have always thought of the token. When you hear token, you think Black. It's an automatic assumption. And all of a sudden I get to this school and I've got 26 students in the class, and one of them is a little 5'10", 5'6" white girl sitting in the corner. She's now the token. And it has forced me to step back and start breaking these hyphens. White privilege, there's one. White privilege is simply the result of white Americans controlling the predominant number of systems in this country for most of the time. It is not an automatic thing. And so I try and tell my students, I'm like, you realize that as long as we're on this campus, we enjoy Black privilege. What are you talking about? And I'm like, listen, there can never be a white president for this university. Every president of this university has to be Black. That's called privilege. Okay. And when we build on that, and we build how the culture, I mean, if you're going, the mere fact is called an HBCU. Guess who's going to be privileged just by the very title? And so trying to explain to them that, in fact, you can separate these concepts. The very notion of privilege is a systemic concept. It's not a cultural concept. It's only made cultural because for so long, one group has had access to those systems and their privileges that we've just naturally assumed that they're one and the same. And that's just not the case. And so much of what I've been doing with my students is trying to disabuse them of the idea that to speak a certain way, write a certain way, dress a certain way, whatever it is inherently of one race or another. I feel like that's the false narrative that's been put forth.
Darius, can I share with you a podcast that, as far as education, had a big effect on me and my thinking, called Nice White Parents.
I'm going to put in my email in the chat, and so please feel free to forward any links or anything. I'd be happy to look at them, and I really do look at them.
Yeah, it's about education and so-called, quote unquote, nice white parents trying to fix schools and the impact. It's a 5-part series. It's really excellent in exploring the opportunities and the problems associated with education in America.
Yeah, I'd be very happy to look at it. Like I said, I'm getting to the point now where I feel like 50 years worth of collecting data and information, I'm pretty much ready to start writing my book here at some point. And so I'm gathering as much information as I can.
So you're accepting the fact that maybe you're a scholar. You used to tell me that you weren't, but you are.
Well, the way I put it is that I did get my pass, and so I technically do get to go into the ivory tower, but I'm kind of relegated to the ground floor with the coffee shop and magazines. I don't get to wander the upper levels as much, but it's all good. I feel like in the end, everything's working out the way it's supposed to. That's what I tell myself.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you something about our current situation.
Hey.
Go ahead. I think Rick had a question. Rick?
I'm sorry.
Actually, Rick Spellman had a question.
Go ahead.
Do all roads include public preschool and early childhood education and care?